The word Welsh comes from the famous Proto-Germanic Walhaz, which has the reconstructed meaning of something like foreign. Because of history, this word has popped up in all sorts of weird and wacky places. So not only Welsh, Wales, and Cornwall, but also Gaul, Wallonia, Vlachs, Wallachia, some other places, and even the walnut. Welsh is a Celtic language. There are two groups of Celtic languages today: the Goidelic or Gaelic languages, Irish, Manx, and Scottish Gaelic, and Brythonic or Brittonic, Welsh, Cornish, and Breton. We don't know how long ago Celtic speakers arrived on Britain, but a probably safe estimate is to say that they've been living there since the first millennium BCE. When the Romans invaded in the 1st century CE, the Celts were speaking a language we today refer to as Common Brittonic. During the British Roman period, hundreds of Latin words for concepts that Celts weren't familiar with flooded into the language. It's also likely that Latin had a grammatical impact. Official Roman presence on Britain lasted until the year 410. Archaeological evidence tells us that Germanic-speaking populations had also reached Britain at least around the same time that the Roman province was abandoned. By 500, Germanic kingdoms were established in eastern Britain, and around 600 pushed Celtic-dominated regions into the periphery. Those places are roughly equivalent to modern-day Wales, Cornwall, and Cumbria, as well as migrants that fled to Brittany. This is when we can say the history of the modern Brittonic languages begins, including Welsh. I'll point out now that most of the history section of this video, until about the 1990s, is coming directly from Janet Davies' book, The Welsh Language, A History. So if you want an even more in-depth description than the paraphrase I'm going to give you, definitely read that book. Wales continued to be ruled by Celts until the Norman invasion of England in 1066, where gradual conquests into Welsh territory definitively ended in 1283, when Wales was wholly conquered by England. While some of the Welsh nobility may have known how to speak Norman, and some Norman words did filter their way into the Welsh language, the Welsh people only spoke Welsh. But some Norman colonies in parts of southern and eastern Wales quickly changed the language of some peripheral parts of the country. Some of these places wouldn't have Welsh speakers in them again until the 20th century. Wales lost its right to self-governance in 1535 when English law became the law of Wales, and Wales was officially incorporated into the Kingdom of England. The Laws in Wales Act, as it's called, also included a provision about language. It states that all justices, commissioners, sheriffs, coroners, escutors, stewards, and their lieutenants, and all other officers and ministers of the law, shall proclaim and keep the sessions, courts, hundreds, leets, sheriffs' courts, and all other courts in the English tongue, and all oaths of officers, juries, and inquests, and all other affidavits, verdicts, and wagers of law to be given and done in the English tongue. And also that, from henceforth, no person or persons that use the Welsh speech or language shall have or enjoy any manner, office, or fees within this realm of England, Wales, or other the King's dominion, upon pain of forfeiting the same offices or fees unless he or they use and exercise the English speech or language. Technically speaking, under the other provisions of the same act, Welsh and English people were equal under the law in every way, except in the way of language. Although, in a country where most people didn't speak English, that pretty much made it so that they weren't equal. Because of this act, the Welsh aristocracy would be completely English-speaking by the late 1700s, and so, from this point forward, the Welsh language's role fundamentally changed. An important aspect of Welsh is that it had and continued to have a robust literary tradition. Welsh or Brittonic literature likely dates back to as early as the 6th century. Welsh manuscripts would continue to be produced throughout the centuries, and with the coming of the Protestant Reformation, vernacular language became a more important part of religious practice. Due to that fact, the Welsh also produced religious texts. In 1546, the first Welsh language book, Religious in Nature, was published and printed. The first full-length Welsh Bible was published in 1588, which, for a language whose only mention in law was to describe how its use would get you fired, is exceptionally early. Throughout the 1600s, though, Welsh lost some of the literary punch it had as a language of high culture, as the creation of epic poetry and literature became a thing of the past. Instead, Welsh literature took on a more lower-class feel, while English gradually occupied more and more of the upper echelons of society. This doesn't change that outside of the gentry, Wales was still monoglot, only Welsh-speaking. This literary decline coincided with the increasing absence of Eisteddfod poetry competitions, which would only become widespread again in the late 18th century. Starting in the late 1600s and early 1700s, the English missionaries in Wales had basically given up on trying to teach the Welsh how to speak English, and instead printed books and materials in Welsh. In turn, the number of Welsh publications shot up drastically. While the schools established by these missionary organizations did sometimes teach English, many of them would teach through Welsh. Coinciding with this massive increase in language material, the mid to late 1700s saw the introduction of rotating religious schools that taught the ordinary people how to read. This led to Wales having a high literacy rate, maybe even more than 50%, which in turn created demand for more written material, and the number of books in Welsh continued to rise exponentially. In the mid-1700s, Wales was still overwhelmingly composed of monoglot Welsh speakers, and schools that taught through English made up a tiny percentage of the whole. Around this same time is when the Industrial Revolution started. More Welsh literature is created, including the first newspapers. Industrialization further sparked migration, much of which was internal migration within Wales, which actually helped re-spread the language to Wales's urban centres where English was gaining dominance. Inward migration from England was a double-edged sword. When English-speaking migrants made up a small percent of a community, they and their families would often be assimilated as new Welsh speakers. In other communities where the number of English speakers were larger, Anglicization could occur rapidly. In general, Wales was becoming increasingly bilingual. The economic boom caused by industrialization meant that in the first half of the 19th century, the number of Welsh speakers exploded. But they couldn't outpace immigration, and so their proportion decreased. By this time, there were basically no Welsh speakers of any meaningful status, and Welsh was considered the language of labor, while English was the language of social mobility. Despite this, most Welsh children in the early 1800s were attending Welsh medium schools. And in 1846, a commission was created to examine the state of schools in Wales. 3 Englishmen did the research and published their finding in 1847. Let's read some of the comments they made. The poor seem ignorant on most subjects, except how to cheat and speak evil of each other. They appear not to have an idea of what the comforts of life are. The vices of lying, thieving, swearing, and drunkenness, and the vastly increasing crime of illicit intercourse between the sexes prevail to a great extent, and these are by no means confined to the uneducated. There is a certain laxity of morals here, which may be easily accounted for, and entirely attributable to the overwhelming number of beer shops, which are open at all times and where people resort to and remain to a very late hour. Drunkenness and illegitimacy are the prevailing vices of the neighbourhood. The standard of morality is certainly low. Illegitimate children are by no means rare, and pregnancy before marriage is of common occurrence. The Welsh are more deceitful than the English. There are at least 2,000 persons living in the town in a state of the greatest filth, and to all appearance they enjoy their filth and idleness, for they make no effort to get rid of it. From my experience of Ireland, I think there is a very great similarity between the lower orders of Welsh and Irish. Both are dirty, indolent, bigoted, and contented. The morals of a great number are defective in respect of chastity, truth-telling, and veneration for God's sacred name. They, the young people, often meet at evening schools and private houses for the preparation of punk, and this tends to immoralities between the young persons of both sexes, who frequently spend the night afterwards in haylofts together. The morals of the poor are generally indifferent. They are not disposed to commit atrocious crimes, but are addicted to petty thefts and prevarication. I think you get the idea. This book had 2 effects on the Welsh. Some, probably most, took it as real criticism, seeing the only way forward as becoming more English. Others took it as an insult and wanted to carve a path towards further separation from the English, though we'll get back to that later, as this battle wasn't settled for another 150 years. The completion of the Commission's treacherous books roughly coincided with the completion of the railways into Wales. The railway led to an even greater influx of English migrants and tourists, which even further deprecated the areas of use for Welsh. On the other hand, the railways also allowed for even easier distribution of Welsh literature and greater attendance to Welsh cultural festivals. The railways also assisted in the nationalization of Welsh identity, which was previously more community-driven. While Anglicization struck greater parts of the Welsh-speaking border regions, Welsh monolingualism was still rampant in large swaths of Wales. Looking at education again, the mid-1800s saw more and more English language schools until the Education Act of 1870, which made it mandatory for all schools in Wales to teach through English. Schools were even monetarily incentivized to have pupils that were good at English. Of course, there was no similar incentive for Welsh. This is right after the time where the famous Welsh not punishment came from, but as we know today, this was probably quite rare. Over the 20 years after the Education Act, a push was made to encourage the teaching of English through Welsh, as opposed to the alternative of teachers speaking in English to a room of monoglot Welsh children. Dan Isaac Davies, who fathered this push, also published a series of articles under the name Tair Miliwn o Gymri Dwyieithog, which is a title that will become more relevant later. Davies' accomplishment was to get the message out there, and in 1890 the expanded use of Welsh in schools was allowed, such as bilingual books, though these were probably rare. 1891 is when we finally have our first census that posed a question about the Welsh language in Wales. 910,000, 54% of the country. The next two censuses continued to see an increase in Welsh speakers, 929,000 in 1901 and 977,000 in 1911, nearly a million speakers of Welsh. But at the same time, the percent of Wales that spoke Welsh continued to decrease as migration into Wales accelerated. And for the first time in the history of Wales, less than half of its population spoke Welsh and less than 10% were Welsh monolinguals. This wasn't a wholly bad thing though. A seemingly never-ending period of crippling poverty drove stake after stake into the heart of Irish. While industrialization in Wales allowed Welsh to become an urban language with relevance outside of only the very lowest social strata. Not only was Welsh literature a never-ending goldmine funding the language, but the late 1800s and early 20th century saw the creation of Welsh language societies and labor unions. The 1921 census shows us the harsh impacts of the First World War and the first decline in numbers, 922,000. A generation of Welsh speakers lost. After the war, industry in Wales suffered. Ruralities were abandoned, people migrated out of Wales, and Welsh language newspapers went defunct. But Welsh didn't fall by the wayside. The 1930s saw the foundation of Plaid Cymru, whose platform featured the defense of the Welsh language prominently. 1931, 909,000. In the 1930s, the BBC created a broadcasting region for Wales and supported the creation of more Welsh language material. While Welsh was gaining more recognition, including in schools, Welsh was still absent in any official function. In fact, the 1535 Act that officially brought Wales under English law was still the law, and Welsh was not allowed to be used in the courts or by any people in government in any of the king's domains, which was a lot of the world. This was only overturned in 1942, although this only brought Welsh in line with other foreign languages. Welsh wouldn't actually be equal to English in the courts until 1993. The impacts of the Second World War were not as large as those of the 1930s Depression. While the census wasn't taken during the war, 1951 saw a massive decrease to 714,000 speakers. 1961, 656,000. The 1960s saw a huge push by the likes of the Welsh Language Society to create equality between English and Welsh. 1971, 542,000. By the date of this census, there are probably no more adults who are monoglot Welsh speakers. 1972 saw the recommendation that all street signs should be bilingual, but this wasn't legislated until 2016, where now Welsh must be above the English. 1981, 503,000. In 1982, S4C, the Welsh language TV station, after a long battle, finally went on air. Over this period, the impacts of deindustrialization became more apparent, and many of the Welsh speakers living in the Welsh language heartland in the north and west moved away for better economic opportunities. The depopulation of large parts of rural Wales saw an influx of English migrants who further tipped the scales. But Welsh medium education proliferated over the same period, and by 1999, all children were to have Welsh lessons, and schools are mandated to offer Welsh until age 16. 1991, 508,000. Over the last century, the Welsh language declined from nearly 1 million speakers to a mere 500,000. Ultimately, the Welsh people still had little to no say over how their country was run, and frankly, history has consistently shown that the English looked down upon the Welsh with either apathy and disinterest, or neglect, or even hatred and ill will. Let's go all the way back to the Laws in Wales Act that formally merged England and Wales. Even though this document severely diminished the importance of Welsh, it's hard to say that it was crafted out of malice. It's more likely that this 16th century document was created by 16th century people who just wanted their job to be as easy as possible and wanted to avoid the hassle of translating all their laws into Welsh. In other words, the Laws in Wales Act was probably not produced with any active prejudice towards the Welsh in mind. 300 years later, when the 1847 findings of the Commission on the State of Education in Wales was published, it's clear that these comments were written by individuals who had a deeply ingrained animosity, ignorance, and prejudice towards the Welsh people. Around the same time, the verb to Welsh was popularized. Coming directly from the ethnic identifier refers to defaulting on a small obligation. This points to another negative stereotype that the English had about the Welsh. The 20th century saw a number of events that also demonstrated general mistreatment. In 1940, there was the forced eviction of the Welsh-speaking town of Mynydd Epynt for the creation of an army training camp. In 1965, the Tryweryn Valley, which contained the Welsh-speaking village of Capel Celyn, was flooded for the creation of a reservoir to feed industry in England. And, most famously, on October 21st, 1966, a coal mining spoil tip controlled by the UK's national coal industry and that was knowingly placed on unstable ground, partially liquefied and fell on portion of the town of Aberfan, destroying a number of houses and half the town's middle school, resulting in the death of 28 adults and 116 children. Alfred Robbins, head of the National Coal Board at the time, after hearing about the disaster that unfolded, infamously attended a ceremony in his honor instead of leaving to the disaster site. It's events like these that help show an anti-Welsh prejudice did exist and persists today. It's not then surprising that, after a push, the Senedd, or Welsh Parliament, was created in 1999. Wales, now with its own government, laid the foundation of being able to later legislate issues of the Welsh language, something the UK Parliament had no reason to be interested in. The 2001 census is important because it's the first year where we see a meaningful increase in the number of Welsh speakers since 1911, 582,000, which is quite a large increase from the previous census's 508,000. This increase is due largely to a boom in children learning the language in school. 2001 created quite a folly, and people became incredibly enthusiastic about the future of Welsh. 10 years later, Welsh was finally made an official language in Wales, and the country could now stylize itself as a bilingual nation. This idea that Wales is bilingual is interesting, and not only because it is historically true. As we covered earlier, some parts of Wales have been English-speaking for the better part of 800 years. Bilingual Wales, I believe, is a pretty unique approach. Today, in theory, Welsh and English are to be treated as equal. The eventual goal of this is that any person living in Wales will be able to carry out any part of their life in English, Welsh, or both. That is, in the home, in the public sector, and even in the private sector. I don't know of any other country like this. While there are other countries with two or even more official languages, their distribution or usage is rarely equal, and it isn't evident that equality is a goal. I think that in Wales it is a possible future. The, in my opinion, attractive goal of Wales is to provide a truly bilingual environment over the entirety of its territory, and indeed, today there are Welsh speakers all over Wales. That hadn't been true since the Norman Conquest. Another important part of Wales that makes the pitch of bilingualism probably quite a bit easier is that as long as modern Welsh identity has existed, speaking Welsh hasn't been a requisite for being Welsh. For example, in 2021, 63% of the people living in Wales identified as being Welsh. That's nearly 2 million people, a number much larger than the number of Welsh speakers. That doesn't mean, of course, that speaking Welsh doesn't strengthen Welsh identity, but rather that not speaking Welsh doesn't exclude you from being Welsh. This evokes the idea that the Welsh language isn't tied uniquely to the identity of a people, but also to the physical borders of Wales. Not only are Welsh people bilingual, but Wales itself is innately bilingual. While Welsh speakers are obviously more difficult to find among people who were born outside of Wales, in 2021 that number was still over 7%. I see that as a pretty significant minority of the likely non-Welsh population learning Welsh either through school or through self-study, owing to the fact that Wales, in addition to being a place where people speak English, is a place where people speak Welsh. A bilingual Wales has the ability to trailblaze for other Celtic languages, but, of course, much of the reason why we haven't seen such an ambitious bilingual country as the one proposed by the Welsh government is because it might be impossible. Most examples of balanced bilingualism in countries around the world exist where there is a clear segregation between where one language is used and where the other is used. Whether Wales has the potential to change this or create a new kind of linguistic landscape is something we should all be excited to see. The year that Welsh was legislated as an official language was the same year as the 2011 census. Those results crushed the hopes of many people in the Welsh-speaking sphere because the census once again showed a downtrend in the number of Welsh speakers across nearly all of Wales, and particularly in the heartland. One of the largest culprits in this decrease was migration. Both migration into Wales from the rest of the UK, as well as migration out of Wales, especially from those living in the frankly economically unattractive regions of the Welsh-speaking heartland. In numbers, 90% of the population increase in Wales from 2001 to 2011 was due to migration. Overall, the Welsh government had a pretty sober understanding of the demographic changes that caused a decrease of Welsh speakers and vowed to make changes. I'll just spoil the results right now and tell you that the 2021 census showed another decrease in the number of Welsh speakers. The Welsh government is pretty keen on blaming this second decrease in a row as a result of the pandemic, and while I don't think that's a crazy reasoning, it's far from the only one. Much of the increase in the number of Welsh speakers in the past 30 years has been due to children learning the language. Virtual learning caused many children who were from English-speaking households to miss out on meaningful Welsh education. But it's still the unsolved issues of economic degradation, deindustrialization, housing crises, and out-migration of Welsh speakers that have important impacts on Welsh. With that being said, this battle is far from over, and despite this slight decrease, Welsh has a lot of things working for it. Welsh has a unique aspect that many other revitalizing languages wish they could emulate, which is that it's not foreign to more casual or modern settings. Welsh not only has the history of being an urban language, but it's one that is found on the internet as well. Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, Welsh can be found on these sites easily. Many revitalization programs throughout history fell into the trap of relying on a top-down form of linguistic expression. That is, people compose music, epics, poetry in an explicitly high art and prestigious register, often grasping onto and attempting to revive a literary tradition that ceased to exist some centuries prior. People in these movements end up using the language for this purpose and this purpose alone. The problem is, speaking like prestigious epic poetry is incredibly unnatural. People just don't talk that way. What you end up doing in this kind of movement is alienating the regular speakers of the language and promoting a hollow literary movement without public support. If you write an incredibly beautiful book, but nobody can read it or relate to it, then you've possibly created art, but you haven't helped revitalize a language. This is the wrong way of doing things. first you speak the language in your everyday life while encouraging and inspiring others to use it as well, and then, from that, people will invent a new and authentic literary tradition. The Welsh government is highly invested in this kind of language use. It's more important for you to be able to talk to a bank clerk in Welsh than to understand complex poetry or to create the equivalent of 30 Welsh Shakespeares. For example, the government has programs promoting the use of Welsh at work and runs workshops on how people with native fluency of Welsh at home can adopt workplace-related vocabulary. These are intelligent programs that will allow for the greater usage of Welsh in everyday life. And hey, even though the number of Welsh speakers has decreased in the past 20 years, the number of people using Welsh on a daily basis has increased. That's not an absolute victory, but it's an incredibly important metric to keep track of. Notwithstanding any more international catastrophes, if the number of Welsh speakers has decreased again in 2031, then I think I'd begin to get worried, and it would be time to do some serious overhauls of the system, but things aren't grim right now. In the background of all of these developments is the 2017 plan revealed by the government to have 1 million speakers of Welsh by 2050. Over the next 25 years, Wales wants to have a massive push towards educating people in Welsh so that it can achieve the goal. This is despite the number of people in Welsh medium education having been rather stagnant over the past decade. This is a super ambitious plan that will require Wales to convert a substantial portion of the children migrating into and being born in Wales into Welsh speakers. There's a not unsubstantial amount of criticism towards this plan, but I think that if it can create enough buzz to get people more and more interested in Welsh, and even if in 2050 they fall short by a few 100,000 speakers, I would still consider it a success. There are a couple other factors at play that I think are important for you to be able to form your own opinions about the present and future of Welsh. Firstly is that in England, detailed language data about Welsh is not collected during the census, meaning we really have no idea how many speakers live in England or in other parts of the UK. But one 2007 estimate says there may be over 100,000. Janet Davies says there may be as many as 200,000, meaning some 15 to 27% of all Welsh speakers could be living outside of Wales. In addition to the rest of the UK, there are also Welsh speakers living in other parts of the British Commonwealth. There's probably a couple thousand Welsh speakers spread across Canada, New Zealand, and Australia, and then a couple thousand more living in the United States. The next place with a meaningful number of Welsh speakers and fun historical factoid is Patagonia. In the 19th century, some Welsh people thought that the writing was already on the wall for their language and wanted to live in a new place away from English influence, where they could practice their culture and use their language without interference. A few Welsh colonies were attempted in the New World before, and different places were being considered for a new one. Eventually, with help and cooperation from the Argentine government, Patagonia was decided on. The person spearheading this movement was Michael D. Jones, who had also lived in Welsh colonies in the United States and was otherwise a big player in the founding of Welsh nationalism. In 1865, a little more than 150 Welsh people landed in Patagonia on the Mimosa. After some time of brief hardship and being aided by the Argentine government and the indigenous Tehuelche people, the colony reached a brief period of success. As the Welsh weren't in close proximity to any other sizable European colony, they were able to conduct all of their affairs through the Welsh language. This was short-lived though, as soon enough the stabilized Argentine government wanted to expand its authority and create its own national identity, and did so by inviting further colonization from Europe into Patagonia and making sure those people learned Spanish as the national language. The Welsh speakers of Patagonia quickly became even more minoritized than they were in Wales, and the world basically forgot about their language until the mid-1900s, when Welsh people from Wales decided to make contact. Today, there are still Welsh speakers in Patagonia, and so we can probably call it the most successful Welsh colony, but their numbers are probably around a few thousand. While Welsh culture can still be found around the cities and place names of the area that the Welsh originally settled, they make up a tiny, tiny minority of what is now known as Chubut province. Welsh is taught in schools, even to students who aren't descendant from Welsh people, albeit in an inconsistent and many times effectively ceremonial way. As the paper I read on this subject puts it, the state, now unchallenged in its hegemonic status, is able to tolerate a measure of reactivation of the local language. Words that ring true across the world. I'll also just quickly mention the irony of the Welsh leaving their homeland where they were minoritized to effectively aid in the minoritization of other peoples in the New World. While this was far from only being a crime that the Welsh were guilty of, it's worth a mention nonetheless. The last thing I want to add is about census results. Linguistic census data is bad. Honestly, data about the number of speakers of a language in general is bad. When someone fills out the census form on if they speak Welsh, yes or no, nobody is checking the veracity of how they answered. Someone who is all but fluent in Welsh could check no, as they feel they still have room to improve in the language, while a new learner who just figured out how to form simple sentences might check yes. The important realization here is that neither of these people are technically wrong. They both speak Welsh. Speaking a language is a continuum. For example, after making this video, I've learned a tiny bit of Welsh myself. Enaid. Do I speak Welsh? Yeah, I just did it and everyone heard me. But do I speak Welsh? No, not even a little bit. The point is, this question is subjective and census results are flawed. You might think that this has a relatively minor impact, and most people would sort of answer based off the same unspoken standards of fluency. But in the Welsh situation, we actually do have two censuses that are run in parallel. The census that we've been using this whole time, the metric used for the 1 million Welsh speakers goal, is filled out individually, while the annual population survey is filled out with the help of an interviewer. And while we know that the 2021 census told us that there are around 500,000 speakers of Welsh, the APS told us that there were nearly 900,000. There are a whole bunch of theories on why this mega huge discrepancy exists, but the point is to show you how variable census data can be depending on the way it's collected, and that things can easily change based on social factors. Linguistic enthusiasm might drive a higher number of people to say that they can speak a language despite their relative lack of ability, while linguistic shame can lead more people to say they don't speak a language even though they're fluent. With all that being said, I think you now have a solid understanding on the position of Welsh and the huge number of competing factors that are impacting the language. Like I said at the beginning of this video, there are currently 6 extant Celtic languages. In addition to Welsh, they are Cornish and Breton, and Irish, Manx, and Scottish Gaelic. Out of these 6 languages, Welsh, without a single doubt, has the highest prospects for long-term survival. The ease at which Welsh integrates into new places and mediums is unrivaled. Right now, in 2024, we already know that there will be several more generations of Welsh speakers. That is not something that can be said for the others. This video took a few hundred hours to make, so if you enjoyed yourself and you can spare $5, I would appreciate that. Thank you. Speaking of the others, I want to do a deep dive like this into all the Celtic languages to grow understanding on how language revitalization is done in different contexts. I'm interested in what you all think would be a good choice for the next language I do. The only thing is that I want to do Irish last. Let's just say I have a special relationship with Irish.